Hello and welcome to Criminal Justice Inspection Unpacked, the podcast of Criminal Justice Inspection Northern Ireland, where we explore issues and developments in the criminal justice system. I'm Melanie McVeigh, and today's episode we'll be talking about victims and witnesses and what has been happening to improve the services, treatment and support provided by criminal justice organisations if you are a victim of or a witness to a crime. Joining me is Roisin Devlin from CJI, the lead inspector of the recently published follow-up review of the care and treatment of victims and witnesses, and Julie Wilson, Deputy Director of Victim Support Division in the Department of Justice, who leads on policies and interventions to support victims and witnesses of crime. You're both welcome. I'm also joined by Janice Bunting, Chief Executive with Victim Support Northern Ireland, a passionate advocate for the rights of victims and witnesses, and with over 6 years' experience in the criminal justice sector, who wants to see Northern Ireland at the forefront of victims' rights. And finally, the first Commissioner Designate for Victims of Crime in Northern Ireland, Geraldine Hanna, who's focused on providing a voice for all victims of crime across Northern Ireland, ensuring the rights of victims under the Victims' Charter are promoted, and monitoring those rights to see that they are being delivered. It's great to have each of you with us today, and we're going to kick off by coming first to Roisin. The care and treatment of victims and witnesses has been a focus for criminal justice inspection since it became operational, with the first of a series of 6 reports back in 2005, I believe. The latest follow-up review, which you led, is closely linked to the 2020 report. Can you maybe set the scene, Roisin, and tell us a little bit about the 2020 report and what inspectors found then?
Yeah, it was an important inspection for criminal justice inspection. We were looking at the journey of victims and witnesses through the criminal justice system. But in doing that inspection, we focused mainly on the police and the PPS, the Public Prosecution Service, and the services that they provided to victims and witnesses, and spent a lot of time during that inspection with the Victim and Witness Care Unit, speaking to staff there and getting an understanding of their work through Victim Support NI and also through NSPCC. We spoke to a number of victims and witnesses who had experienced the system so that we could understand from their perspective what that had been like.
And what did you find? Were there recommendations for improvement or change that came about through that piece of work?
Yeah, we found that there were many dedicated individuals working to support victims and witnesses through the system. We made recommendations to improve that. So there were strategic recommendations as well as operational recommendations. One of the important strategic recommendations was to raise awareness of the victim and witness charters to ensure they were accessible to those that needed them and that they were understood. So we asked for a communications plan around that. Another important strategic recommendation was around the Victim and Witness Care Unit. So we asked that there was consideration of that model and enhancing that model to look at the provision of care. So we find that the work that staff do in that unit is hugely important in terms of information provision, ensuring that everyone has what they need to attend court. But what needed improved was how victims and witnesses had their needs assessed and were supported through the criminal justice system. So that recommendation was intended to enhance that.
Okay, and why was it important to go back and have a look at what had been happening since 2020? What was the purpose of this follow-up review?
Well, a number of years have passed and we felt it was important to go back and speak to those organisations involved in the original inspection who had lead responsibility for implementing the recommendations to understand the progress that had been made. And in doing that, we were looking at what actions had been undertaken to implement the recommendations, but also what had the impact been for the intended beneficiaries. So how had those actions improved outcomes for victims and witnesses?
Well, we'll leave it there, and maybe it's an opportunity to bring our other guests in at this point. And I'll maybe come to you, Julie, if you don't mind. Can you maybe give us an idea what steps had been taken to implement the recommendations that were made by CJI?
If I focus mainly on the role, my role within Department of Justice, and within that, I also chair the Victim and Witness Steering Group. The Victim and Witness Steering Group would bring together senior leaders from across the criminal justice system, but also not all just statutory agencies. Victim support is represented on it. So victim representatives, representatives from legal profession, etc. So as a collective, we've looked at the report and put in place a number of steps. We used the report to really inform the development of the new victim, that's not new anymore, but at that time, the victim and witness strategy. So that included looking at, what are our priorities going forward in terms of understanding the needs of victims, in terms of how we meet those needs, putting in place comms around charters, both so that the public and victims and witnesses are able to recognise charters and how they apply to them, but also to really raise awareness internally within agencies as well.
Did you find it helpful to have that report there to assist them with that process?
I think the report has been really helpful. I think we all have spent quite a lot of time trying to understand how the justice system affects victims and witnesses. Are things that we know, because people like Janice and Derry tell us that this is the experiences of victims and witnesses. I think what the report did was it really crystallised down into, here are the key issues around how victims are informed and kept informed of what's going to happen to them through the process, etc. So it gave us a framework to work towards. Our initial focus had been developing that strategy and then putting in place steps to implement that strategy. As part of that, there are some things that we need to do collectively and collaboratively as a system, and there are other things that fall to individual agencies and to do internally as well.
Okay, well, I'll bring Janice in at this point. Sorry, Janice, to be pointing to you at this point so quickly, but can you maybe tell me from your perspective, what do you see has changed over the last sort of 36 months?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of that. I suppose I want to roll back just slightly to the 2020 report. So at the time the 2020 report was published, the Chief Inspector of the Criminal Justice Inspectorate said that victim and witness care is vital to ensuring people are confident that when they report a crime or a witness to it, they will be kept informed and supported. And she felt that failure to do so would impact on public confidence, deter people from reporting the issue. So if you roll forward to the new report that has been published, I suppose there is a disappointment that the hoped for progress has not been fully realised. We are pleased to be part of the Victim and Witness Steering Group, as Julie has mentioned. And so we know there are very committed people within the department and within all of the agencies who want to see that progress going forward. But there have been some small wins that we think could have been achieved that haven't been achieved. And that has had, long-lasting impacts on victims. So, for example, if you think about recommendations to the PPS about letters changing and for those to be more victim-focused and victim-centric, those things have not happened, despite the goodwill of people who want those things to happen. And we know for victims that they feel that those letters still are quite harsh. Roisin mentioned the enhanced needs assessment piece, and it would be wrong of me not to say that this was a comprehensive piece of work that we undertook with PPS and with PSNI, and we believe that that has the opportunity to be such a game changer in the same way many of the Gillen recommendations became game changing in terms of how we can go forward. But what has changed in the last 36 months? We have very good relations with our partners. We have very good relations with the Department of Justice, with PPS, with PSNI.
And does that make doing work easier in the victims and witness sector?
It does, because I believe we have listening ears, and we have listening ears around the table. But all of those organisations are impacted by resources, and both people resources and funding resources, and that has an impact on victims and witnesses. And I think we have to acknowledge and realise that.
I'm going to come across to Geraldine here at this point. What's your view? What would you see would be the differences and the changes that have been implemented? There are some issues, obviously, as Janice alluded to, but what difference are you aware of that the changes have made?
I think, sort of picking up on both Julie and Janice's points, there has been improvements to the treatment of victims and witnesses over the last 36 months. But the improvements haven't necessarily all been borne out by this report. And I think it's very telling in the report that the achievements that have been recognised from the system's perspective versus how it's been assessed by the inspector, there's a discrepancy there. And I think that is down to a willingness, and certainly there's what I see from across the criminal justice agencies and the department is a recognition of the importance of this work and a commitment to move it forward. However, there is a vast amount of work to be taken forward in this area, and the Criminal Justice Inspection 2020 report is one of many reports into this issue. So in the last couple of years, I would probably see the improvements more specifically for certain groups of victims. So in the likes of domestic violence, sexual violence with the Gillen Review, the introduction of the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act. So there has been a lot of effort put in there, and that has understandably then taken resources from across the agencies, which has potentially hampered or hindered progress in other areas. And as Janice said, there's a recognition, I think, from all of us that there are significant resource challenges facing the justice system. It's been historically underfunded and under-resourced, but also with austerity, etc. We're in a situation where we're trying to do, in many respects, more with less than what we had. So there has been progress. I'm disappointed that when it comes to the achievement of the recommendations from this report, which is for all victims of crime, it is that basic level of information communication needs assessment. We're not as far along as I would like to have seen.
Well, you're talking there, maybe this is a question for everybody around the table. Resources are an absolute issue, and that's been acknowledged by everyone. But is that the primary barrier to greater progress, or are there other issues at play? Absolutely. Julie?
I would echo what Geraldine has said. I think there has been progress made. That doesn't all tie into this report. I think resources are always going to be an issue, and they're going to be an issue right across not just the public sector, but all sectors. And they certainly are an issue within the criminal justice system. I think resourcing it's not just about the money. It's also about the people and their capacity and the system's capacity to change. And there have been, Geraldine listed quite a number of really significant transformational pieces. And the system needs, I think, time to absorb and adopt to some of those changes. I think culture change happens slowly and it happens incrementally, and then you maybe reach a tipping point. But there is there are these recommendations under this report, and there are wider recommendations under other reports, and actually the capacity for a system to absorb all of that needs to be taken into account. So I think that is one factor within it. I think another factor, and it's not so much can be a barrier in some ways, but it's also a reality is that the system is made up of different parts, and all of those parts are independent, and that independence is precious and is actually fundamental to how justice is delivered. That independence, though, means that we need to work collaboratively.
That interdependence piece comes into play.
Absolutely. And I think that takes time. It also takes, I think, a mental leap from everybody within each of those individual organisations to begin to look through the perspective of others in order to understand, well, what are the pressures, what are the things that this organisation needs to balance, what are the considerations. And I think a lot of this ultimately will come down to balancing different considerations, balancing different interests, balancing different priorities. Ultimately, we're moving a whole system forward, but in doing that, it is, I think, a really precariously balanced exercise to do that, and the independence of those organisations is part of that.
Might come in North, suppose. I think it was your Chief Inspector Jackie Durkin in a previous report talked about the system being independent, but we need for that interdependence. And in reading through the report, I think what does frustrate me is that we're not collaborating enough. It's clear that there's a willingness from the agencies to improve this area, but the fact that we're progressing some of these issues in silos, so we see individual agencies making progress, really demonstrates the need for me, from my perspective, for a more collective ownership and governance of the system. And that I think is a challenge, because whilst of course these agencies need to be independent in terms of their decision making with their own responsibilities, when it comes to the needs and treatment of victims and witnesses, that's a collective responsibility, and it's something that they need to collectively own, but also be held collectively responsible for. And because of the independence, what you see with the recommendations is that it then comes down to agencies. But ultimately, from the victim and witness perspective, they don't care whether it's a police officer who's supposed to do it, or a prosecutor, or if that's the judge's responsibility. They want a system that treats them with dignity and respect from the moment they report right through to the disposal of that case. And that's where the challenge falls. I think we need greater ownership and greater collaboration across those agencies.
I'm going to bring Roisin in just to pick up on a point that was made earlier on, and that was around a mismatch that was found between how organisations and agencies believed that they had progressed, work that they had achieved, and actually what the independent inspection found when the evidence was looked at. Is that something that you were surprised by, Roisin, or what would your take on that be?
We had discussions around that when we met with the different agencies, and had been clear that when we are looking at recommendations and whether they have been achieved, partially achieved or not achieved, we wanted to see the activities that had been undertaken, but also what the outcomes had been for victims and witnesses. Some of the time it was perhaps just that more time was needed to demonstrate and measure that. Other times we felt that it just wasn't available to us. So for example, where there could have been more collaboration or where resource had hampered progress, we would have liked to have seen more analysis around that. So what was the plan in light of those resource considerations? So the working paper for the Enhanced Victim and Witness Care Unit, we know the huge amount of work that went into that and how much it was supported, which recognised, I think, strategically that it was needed. So we understand there wasn't the resource at that time, but what was the plan then instead? And rather than to say it would be revisited, how was there any planning around what would be required to implement it over time? So that was the kind of evidence we were looking for. Similarly with the charters, we understood there was a lot of work undertaken by the agencies and the steering group together to raise awareness of those including within the respective agencies, because that's important too, that police officers are aware, that the Victim and Witness Care Unit is aware of those entitlements. But we wanted to see also then, what did that mean for victims and witnesses? Had their experience improved as a result of that? So that is perhaps where some of the disconnect came, in that agencies perhaps were saying we had achieved it because we have done
various actions and delivered various parts of that recommendation.
We were recognising those, but wanted to see more evidence on how that had impacted other people. So oftentimes something was partially achieved when perhaps agencies had assessed it as achieved, and in some scenarios it was not achieved. So the letter that Janice gave as an example, we accept that it was reviewed, and there was a lot gone into that, but it wasn't actually issued. So,
okay. Well, let's turn the conversation around and look towards the future, because that's important as well. Julie, very briefly, can you give me a flavour of what might be happening at the moment that you're aware of to drive forward those outstanding, partially and unachieved recommendations? What's taking place at the moment?
Well, what I would say is that obviously we've been engaging with Roisin through the follow-up review, and we have obviously seen and heard a flavour of some of the kind of...
You would have seen that through factual accuracy checks and through the sharing process.
Exactly. And I mean, there are aspects to it that I find really helpful, and particularly in terms of looking at, well, what is the role of the Victim and Witness Steering Group? And the Victim and Witness Steering Group is really a voluntary coalition of leaders. But what should our role be in driving compliance against the charges? What should our role be as victims champions? And defining that victim champion role within organisations so that there is more consistency across. I think what I have seen has been a stepping up of the Victim Witness Steering Group. I think we need to step up further, and I think there is an appetite to do that. Certainly in terms of heightening and raising awareness of the charters, at the time when the follow-up review was taking place, we had a plan in place. We had plans to roll out quite a number of events. Those are happening throughout the autumn. We'll look again in next year as to what we do. I'm reaching out to voluntary and community sector, reaching out to other sectors to really raise awareness. What I've also seen within that Victims Witness Steering Group coalition is a greater... So it isn't just about kind of people saying, oh, we're doing this around the table within our respective sectors, but where we have done that kind of what's happening in your sector, what I've seen is a genuinely a consistent movement towards heightening a more trauma-informed approach to the justice system and to the delivery of justice, and that was quite obvious the last time we met. So there are a number of steps that we need to take. I think we need to fundamentally look at what's our role and what can we do as a steering group and as leaders within our organisation. I think leadership is really important.
I will come back to you about that, but Janice was nodding there on a few points, so just wanted to pick up. Would you agree with some of that, Janice? Is that the progress, or is that the sense that you're picking up?
I would say there's a lot of good work going on behind the scenes in terms of that you won't see coming through in the report maybe just yet. You know, pick up on the point that Julie has made about the Victim Witness Steering Group. We are participants and contributors to that, and we're active contributors. So, we are being heard. We are able to directly represent the views of victims and witnesses directly to the people who can affect change and make, change happen faster and have better impacts, for for victims. The trauma-informed piece that Julie has talked about, we have been part of, both the delivery of that and looking at how that could be better rolled out across the PSNI and the more seasoned PSNI officers. We've also done some training with PPS, and we are able to go to that meeting and to contribute to that by bringing forward pieces of research that we have done where victims are telling us, this is what held back my recovery, and these are the things that need to change. There was maybe a lack of information, and so the people at the top are hearing that, and they're hearing what we are saying, in terms of the I suppose the raising of the Victims' Charter. I think there is also a reality we have to live within, which is many people in society don't think of victims until they are required to think of it. So they're not getting up.
It happens to them, or somebody that is close to them.
They know. Yeah. So they're not getting up in the morning and having the same focus that they would say have on health issues as they are having on victims' issues. And then it happens to them, and that becomes then the focal point. What are my rights? What are my entitlements? So as Julie said, there are planned series of events for Victim Charter raising to raise the awareness of the Victims' Charter. We are part of that. We're privileged to be a part of that, to be able to help the department bring that forward and to communicate that.
Can I just pick up as well with you about, Julie mentioned there about victims champions. Maybe what is their role from your perspective, and how can they assist?
Well, I will speak very, very directly in relation to the Victims' Champions. We know who they are within the different organisations, and they are my first go-to if I have a problem with people who are coming back to me and saying this is not happening or that is not happening. I can go directly to a Victims' Champion and ask them to examine that in their own organisation. And I have to say that my engagement so far with some of those Victims' Champions has been very positive.
They're open to those conversations and that feedback.
Honest conversations. They are open to that very honest conversation. It says, your organisation did not perform well in this. How can we perform? How can we reassure and build confidence in that victim? Because what victims are telling us is they need to have confidence in the system, but they also want answers. So if something isn't going right or isn't, they don't understand it, to have that information, to have that direct line of communication, and at times there has been that direct communication between the victim and the Victims' Champion, for them to be able to ask uncensored questions, to say, what about my circumstances here? That's a very, very positive step. I think one of the things that would benefit more is that we continue to raise the Victims' Champion profile.
And that is something that has been flagged within the follow-up review about the need for that Victims' Champion piece to have greater profile within their own organisations and across the different organisations as well.
And I would agree with that, and I would be seeing that as being a focus if we're doing the Victim Charter sessions, that people are made aware, there are victim champions in this organisation. And you have to think about that. Victim champions, in organisations you wouldn't expect to see maybe victims champions, and I think that's positive stuff.
Geraldine, I'm just going to bring you in relation to the Victims' Charter aspect. You'll have seen and you'll have heard both in your current role and previous roles about the devastating impact of what a minor offence can potentially have on a person. There's been a lot of activity and focusing on particular victims, those to ensure they're appropriately supported, victims of sexual or domestic violence, for example, or even those that might have particular individual needs or vulnerabilities. Young people, just again as an example, and ensuring those needs are met. But how do we ensure that all victims and witnesses receive the care and support that they need, that it's not determined by the type of offence, unfortunately, that you experience or you witness? And how do we ensure those rights under the Victim and Witness Charters are available? Maybe it's quite a lot for you there, but
I think it's captured in this report, and it's the needs assessment model. So the two fundamental building blocks for victim care, in mind you, are needs assessment and advocacy. And absolutely every victim, regardless of crime type, need those two basic foundational pieces in place. Because regardless of what your needs are, what group you're from, what crime you've experienced, your response and needs will be different. So in order to do that, we need to assess individuals, and that means every individual. Of course, the needs assessment model and service when it's in place. And I say when because we will get there. Just probably not as quick as I would like, but we will get there. But when it's in place, it will no doubt have an element of triage where you identify, you give greater attention to certain groups or needs, but everyone needs the basic needs assessment. And then coming with that, and I said that the two building blocks is the advocacy piece, and I'm really struck by an initiative in Quebec where we have that they are piloting a needs and advocacy service. So not only do you get that needs assessment, you have an advocate that helps ensure the needs are met, and that's back to your rights piece. So we assess your needs, and then we have someone who is going to advocate to ensure that you get it. That advocate will know what your rights are. And very often what I hear from victims all the time, and it's picking up on Janice's point, you don't know what your rights are because you haven't really thought about being a victim of crime. Who wants to think about such a thing until it happens to you? So once we get those rights in place, we need the advocates to ensure that they're flagging that this is an issue for someone and ensuring that they get that. And for me, that first fundamental building block is that needs assessment piece, which I really hope that we get progressed.
Julie, just going back to you mentioned about the importance and the value that leadership has in delivery of these pieces. How important is it for you to see those leaders involved in leading in their organisations and directing this journey?
I think leadership is critical, and I think I can see in the time that I've been in this role, I can see leaders stepping into this role and making a difference. And I think you can see that in, for example, the Lady Chief Justice's opening speech for the opening of this court session, where she was very focused on particularly the needs of vulnerable victims and witnesses within the criminal justice system. And at the very recent opening of the Belfast Remote Evidence Centre, the Director of Public Prosecutions, again, very, very, very clearly, no doubt, throwing his support behind the availability of that centre and those kind of initiatives to support victims and to take some of the trauma out of the criminal justice system. I think those kind of really strong messages at a senior level need to be heard throughout all organisations. So I do think that that's part of culture change. I do think culture change takes time, but it doesn't happen without that leadership.
Roisin, would that echo with you the importance of and the value that strong leadership and direct involvement and prioritisation will make around this issue?
Yeah, we find the victim champion role to be really important and really vital. We met with those victim champions. There is work to be done in enhancing that role, ensuring more cohesion among the group. Some of them are new to the role. But yes, we would agree with that. And also what Geraldine has said around everyone having access to that needs assessment at base, access to the information that they need.
I see in the follow-up review there's a commitment to go back and look again at these issues and the progress. How will you be maintaining that focus?
We felt that some of the recommendations had been partially achieved and with more time could move towards fully achieved, and it is something that we would want to look at again.
And you will be going back then to monitor that progress?
Yes.
With that focus on the outcomes for the victims?
Yes, our focus will be on how have things changed for victims and witnesses, yes.
Just to wrap up the conversation, just maybe a question for each and every one of you. What would you each say to victims and witnesses so they're not put off reporting a crime or seeking a criminal justice outcome? Maybe Roisin, could I go to you?
I think today we've heard about the commitment that is there from leaders and also individuals who are working in the criminal justice system and in the voluntary sector also to support victims and witnesses.
I will come to Janice because you work quite often at the coalface in this area.
We do, and I would be saying to victims and witnesses, please come forward. You will be believed, you will be supported. There are structures around you now that can do that for you and take you through from point of report to when you go to court.
Julie, anything to add?
I think I would want to acknowledge how difficult it is, and that the criminal justice process is alien to a lot of people until you actually experience it firsthand. It's disorientating, and it can be traumatic. But I would echo what Janice has said. I would encourage people to come forward. That the supports are there, and that we are working to improve outcomes.
And Geraldine?
Probably would echo all of what has been said. What I would say to the victims is, really, anyone listening to this, the system isn't working at its optimum. We recognise that, but hopefully in listening to this, there's a sense that progress is being made.
Well, thank you very much, each and every one of you. That brings to a close another frank, engaging discussion on this episode of Criminal Justice Inspection Unpacked. Thank you to all my guests for joining me and shining a spotlight on this important topic of the care and treatment provided to victims and witnesses of crime, an issue that could, as we've heard, personally impact on any one of us at any stage. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation and you'll listen again to our podcast as we explore the issues and challenges facing our criminal justice system in Northern Ireland.